Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Hey, welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Well, here we go again. Another example of the Trump administration trying to strong-arm Canada in this particular case. And the topic this time, of course, is Canada's imminent purchase of a new fleet of fighter jets. Now, you know the story, and I'll say up front, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way, I'm not an expert when it comes to fighter jets, but, you know, what you do in a situation like that is try to find people that know a little bit about this, and I've done that, and I'm going to get into some of the technical stuff at a different level here so we can have a better understanding. But initially, what really pisses me off about this is, once again, the United States is saying, you do it our way or else. And that's the way Trump operates. And too many countries and too many jurisdictions, of course, had just bent their knee and done whatever Trump wanted them to do. And they're asking us, or telling us, really, to do the same thing when it comes to the purchase of fighter jets. This time, of course, it's through the rather, disgusting voice of Pete Hoekstra, who's the U.S. ambassador. We've talked about him on the podcast many times before, but he was shooting his mouth off at a conference just a couple of days ago, and basically saying that, look, there's no trade talks going on between Canada and the U.S. right now. You want your trade talks? You buy our jets, because if you don't buy our jets, you can forget about getting any trade deal. That's the message we're getting from the Trump administration on this. That's blackmail. That's strong arming. That's not what friends do. That's not what allies do, especially not just trading allies, but, of course, when we come to military equipment and defense of North America, there's supposed to be some sort of a relationship here. Trump and his people don't seem to see that, and Hoekstra, obviously, is just echoing exactly what Trump is saying, what he's feeling about these days. The problem here, of course, is what are we going to buy and from whom are we going to buy them? And you know some of the details about this right now. Our government, and this was a couple of years ago now, finally decided after years, and I mean years, of haggling and dragging their heels, okay, we need to upgrade our fighter jets. And after some hemming and hawing, they finally decided on a contract, and they ordered a whole bunch of those. Now, there's about 16 of them, I guess, in production right now. But with the disintegration, I guess, of U.S.-Canada relations over the last little while, a few months ago, Prime Minister Carney decided, and others within the government, that maybe it's time to just put a pause on that right now, and let's look around and see if maybe there is a better deal for Canada here, okay? Not with the 16 that are already being made, but maybe we could talk about going someplace else and getting a better deal. Not just financially, but, of course, you're talking quality and price, right? Just you're buying a car. This is a jet, but you do the same sort of thing and go through the same process if you're buying a high-profile automobile or something. And that's kind of what's going on here. The numbers are a lot bigger, but it should kind of be the same process here, right? So this past week, of course, the Prime Minister was visited by, the King and Queen of Sweden and the Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, along with a whole lot of other people that came over in that entourage, including the President of Saab in Sweden. Saab are the makers of the Gripen jet that is being manufactured in that country, a very efficient piece of equipment, we're told. That other countries have already purchased, and they're saying, look, we can give you a really good deal on these, a better deal than what you're getting, and they're a better product, which caused us to start digging in and saying, well, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Hoekstra is basically saying, no, it's not. This is the epitome of fighter jets around the world, and you're partners with us with NORAD and with NATO, and we have to have complete compatibility, which means that if you don't have our jets and pay our price for them, then we can't have any sort of a partnership here, and you can't have Saabs, and it's just not going to work. Well, that's not true. So, with contrary opinions going back and forth, and since many of us are not experts when it comes to fighter jets, where do we get our information? Who do we believe? And what information is credible here? Well, I'm going to turn to an article that was written, it appeared in the Ottawa Citizen just a couple of days ago. It's called Canada's Battle of the Fighter Jets, F-35 versus the Gripen. The author is David Pouliez. David is an award-winning investigative reporter. He's done some great stuff over the years on a variety of subjects. And he's done the work. He's done the homework on this, about this controversy that seems to be going on. And I want to give you a little bit of his piece here to give us some perspective on what's going on here. As David writes, in part, he says, supporters say that the F-35 is a technological marvel, but admit that it comes with a price. The aircraft has been dogged by concerns about the high cost to maintain the plane and to keep it airworthy. The F-35 remains the most advanced fighter in the world, but too many of them are sitting idle. That's according to a Republican senator. His name is Roger Wicker. He said this during a Senate hearing back in October. He says the readiness rates of our aircraft continue to fall short of Pentagon goals. In other words, they're no good to you if they're sitting on the ground because they don't operate, right? And that's obviously an important factor. As a matter of fact, on that same line of thinking, the problems apparently with the F-35 itself, the ones that Canada will have ordered if we'd go down that way. The plus side is, well, you'll be, working seamlessly with the jets that the Americans are using. But the United States themselves has flagged new problems with the F-35 variant that Canada plans to buy, including the fact that the weapon capabilities are not what they promised. And to fix it is about $6 billion over budget, and they're about 5 years behind schedule. So, again, doesn't sound like a very interesting proposal here, does it? Now, of course, the Americans are going to argue that, well, maybe so, but it's still a better aircraft than the Gripen. And besides, you can't have two kinds of aircraft in your fleet. Well, yeah, we can, quite frankly. And I know that David talks about this in the article. But historically, the RCAF has used two different kinds of planes in their fleets in the past. No problem there. And as we mentioned earlier, the Gripen is already being used in NATO exercises by other countries. So don't tell me, and by the way, in those exercises, most recently over Poland, they get along just fine with the American side of the fleet too, communications, everything else. So the fact that it's an apples and oranges thing is not really true. As a matter of fact, what some people are saying here, to be frank about it, when they're looking at the U.S. argument here, is maybe the U.S. is so adamant that they don't want the Gripen, they don't think that they're compatible, is because they're afraid that if we do get both, if we take the American order that we've already got going and get some Gripens, that the Gripen is going to be found to be a much more effective, cost-effective, and much more efficient plane than the American plane. So that there's maybe some truth to that. We'll have to wait and see. But certainly there are experts that are going through this evidence right now, trying to determine which is better. But you take everything that the Americans are saying here with a grain of salt. And I say that, well, just about everything that Donald Trump's administration says you should take with a grain of salt. So the jury is still out. The Gripen, quite frankly, sounds like a very, very viable alternative here. And other countries are already using it. So we need to take that into consideration as well. And I think, our government has to see through the rhetoric here and get the best deal for Canada. Operationally, we want the best product, and we want the best price too. And that's what they're saying here. And that is a problem. Plus the fact that we're getting into some of the tech stuff here. Even if we buy the American jets, apparently, the technology, the software, et cetera, is going to still be owned by the U.S. government, which means if they decide, no, you're not going to get the upgrades, or no, it's going to cost you twice as much to buy the upgrades, once again, they're holding us hostage. And don't think that the people in the Trump administration wouldn't do something like that, because they've already done it in so many different ways. So there's that element to it. And I think that all has to be taken into consideration when we're looking at what's going in here. So we say, okay, if it's a better product, though, maybe you have to put up with a little bit of that crap just to get the better product. And the former Chief of Defense Staff from Canada, who is retired General Tom Lawson, is now going public with this right now, and he's warning of the challenges. He says, do not saddle the Royal Canadian Air Force with two fleets. He says it's so enormously destructive. These are his words. Now, I should also mention, by the way, that after he retired, General Lawson actually went and worked, well, guess for Lockheed Martin for the last 6 years. He's a consultant. He's being paid by Lockheed Martin to make the American jet. So how subjective is what he's saying, and how objective is it? Or is this guy who's got his own personal bias now because he's being paid by these guys? I'll let you make that decision, but you have to understand that maybe there's a little bias that's going into play here. That the capacity of the Gripen, but also the point of trying to run two very complex fleets. But as I mentioned before, apparently that's already happening. Now, that's this retired guy who's now working as a lobbyist for the firm that makes the American jets. So take that into consideration. The other point of view comes from still with Canadian expertise here, and it is from the other gentleman who actually recommended this in the first place, that these are the jets that we should be buying right now. And this is from a retired Lieutenant General Yvon Blondin, who is the Air Force general who originally recommended to the Canadian government that they buy the F-35, since the purchase should no longer go forward anymore. Says it's wrong. We have to rethink this. This is the guy that wanted to do it originally. He says that some defense analysts worry about the amount of control that the Americans have over the F-35. I mentioned that just a second ago. They control all the software upgrades and own parts in the planes, and even to be stored in Canada, they can only become Canadian property once they're installed. So in other words, the U.S. is still going to hold a lot of weight over whether these jets can be used or not. He says the reality is that the U.S. consent, no country can operate any of these without their consent. The F-35 purchase made sense when the U.S. was a strong ally with Canada and other NATO nations. But he goes on to say that now with Trump, who's talking about annexing Canada and seizing Greenland from NATO ally Denmark, you can't trust Trump and you can't trust them to use that kind of technology as basically a leverage to try to get whatever they want. And this is something I think has to be weighed into this. I know that some people have mentioned on our podcast and in some of your comments, and now some government officials in the States are saying, oh, come on, don't base it on that. Trump will be gone someday, and that stuff's not going to apply anymore. Well, first of all, there are no guarantees that Trump's going to be gone anytime soon, okay? We thought after his first term we'd never see Donald Trump again, and voila, there he is. And even if he does leave, if it's a J.D. Vance or if it's Marco Rubio or some of these other Trump acolytes, who's to say the same policy is not going to be in place? We have to be wary of that. And Prime Minister Carney has talked about that time and time again, and we do have to be cognizant of that. We don't hate the Americans. We don't hate the American people, but we do have to be wary of the American government and the attitude that they're taking now. It's a different kind of relationship. And I don't know if we're ever going to go back to the friendly attitude that we had. You know, we can freely move back and forth and economies intertwined, etc. Those were the good old days, but we don't know if those good old days are ever going to come back. And we can't base our purchases, which is going to obviously be a huge financial investment, but also a defense investment too, on the fact that maybe better days are ahead. We've got to get the best deal possible now for the best quality. So these are all the things that I think have to be taken into consideration when it comes to this deal. And you're going to hear from both sides, and the government's heard both sides too. And you've got the one guy, of course, who's now a lobbyist and a consultant for the people that make the U.S. jet, saying, no, Canada, don't do that. And the guy who was working for us, who said buy them, and now saying, no, don't. And we know that there are other players. You know, at one time there was some discussion about South Korea as the supplier for these. That seems to have kind of fallen way down the list now. They may still be in the game, I don't know, but the Canadian government's not talking a whole lot about that right now. But the whole thing about this is Canada's commitment to NATO and certainly to NORAD here, North American Defense, and whether or not we're capable with the infrastructure that we've got, and certainly with the tools such as fighter jets to be able to do that. But we also have to understand, notwithstanding what people like Hoekstra and others are saying, is that, look, we're member nations here in NATO, and, well, NORAD has a role to play in this as well. And the other guys are buying other products too. So this idea that you always have to have American fighter jets is really a false argument, really just to prop up that industry. And I know, because I'm sure you've seen the stories. I in my research, I checked into this, and of course, what has happened here is they're basically saying, look, there is already a business relationship here between many Canadian firms that are supplying parts for the American jets. And you know, you buy these American jets, and those companies are going to continue to make those parts here in Canada and ship them down, and that's good for the employment figures in those areas, and everybody lives happily ever after. No, that's not true, and you can't hang your hat on that. We already know that Donald Trump has already told the people that are manufacturing these jets, he wants all of those jobs, all of those parts manufacturing jobs, brought back to the United States, just as he does with almost every other industry. So, you know, a year from now, he may simply say, we're shutting down that operation. I want all that stuff made in Ohio now instead of in Alberta or Ontario or wherever the case might be. And we've lost those jobs. There are no guarantees. However, on the other side of the ledger, of course, Saab and the Swedish government have already said that if we sign on with them, they look at the Saab jet instead, the Gripen jet, that could be upwards of 10,000 Canadian jobs, because they're suggesting that their jets, the Saab jets, would be built here in Canada. So you're going to have a factory, or at least a couple of factories, and you're going to have parts plants, etc. As a matter of fact, they've already said during this little visit that they had earlier this week that if this partnership is to come to reality, that this Saab plant built in Canada with, employing Canadians, would also be responsible for Saab fulfilling other contracts. For instance, Ukraine has already ordered jets from Saab and from Sweden. And they've got to be built someplace, and they're suggesting that could happen here. So there's a sustainability impact to this too. And it's all what if. I get all that. But what the point, I guess, here is that we have to go into this with our eyes wide open. And in past generations, Canadian governments have probably simply said, well, there's a pretty good business case for this. There's a pretty good business case on that side, or for this country too, and for that supplier. But, the short of it is that, America's our best friend. They're our allies. Even if it's going to cost a little bit more, we're better off with them. Well, that's not the case anymore. And we have to open our eyes to that and understand, whether it's the purchase of fighter jets, whether it's any other deals that are coming along, that we have to get the best possible deal for Canada and look at the short-term and long-term ramifications when it comes to the Canadian economy and the Canadian workforce. And I really do resent people like Hoekstra and others simply sticking their nose in and say, yeah, it's a nice little country you got there. I hope nothing happens to it. That's like mafia boss, arm pressure to try to, hey, do it our way or no way. What they could have done, instead of Hoekstra saying, if you don't buy our jets, forget about any trade deal. If they had come back and said, you know what, I know you guys are really concerned about the steel and aluminum tariffs and the softwood lumber tariffs. How about we reduce those tariffs? Or eliminate them, but I don't think Trump would ever do that. How about we reduce that down to, say, 5% or 10% if you buy the jets? Well, that's a bargaining chip. I'm not suggesting that would swing the deal, but it would certainly get the Canadian government's attention, wouldn't it? Because we might say, okay, maybe there's a downside to buying the American jets. There's a lot of things that we need to be concerned about. But if you weigh that against the possibility of reduced tariffs on all of these products, it makes it a tough decision. And it's something that the government would have to seriously consider in a situation like that, especially given the impact that those tariffs are having on our part of the American economy. But that's not happening, because that's not the way Donald Trump does business. Donald Trump's idea of negotiating is my way or no way. You do exactly what I say, and you kneel to me and pay homage to me, or you get nothing. And that's not negotiating. And that's why I and so many other Canadians, of course, are very skeptical about any sort of a trade deal with anything that's for Canada's good, as long as the Trump administration is in power down there. But they're exerting that same sort of my way or no way attitude towards the purchase of the fighter jets. And at some point, I want a Canadian government to stand up to them and say, no, we're going to do what's best for us. And I know there's probably going to be consequences. I get that if we decide, okay, we'll take your 16 jets, guys, but we're going to go and get those and maybe the Saab jet, maybe the Gripen, whatever the case may be, wherever the government decides, there's probably going to be pushback. I get that. That's the way a petulant president like Donald Trump is going to operate. And I don't relish the fact that there's probably going to be a negative price to pay for that. But do we fall prey to that and simply say, well, we better give in then, even though it's not a good deal? Even though we may pay more for these, and they may end up sitting on the runway because they don't operate? That just doesn't seem to make any sense to us. So it's not going to be a simple decision, and it's going to be a costly decision. But we have made a commitment through NATO and through NORAD, and it's included in the budget that just passed, of course, just a couple of days ago in Parliament, about a renewed commitment and a larger commitment to defense. And I'm supportive of that. And I think most Canadians are supportive of that. We see what's going on around the world, not just, here in Canada, but, the Northland, our sovereignty up into the Northland when it comes to the Northwest Passage. And we know that the Russians, the Chinese, and others are involved in that. And Sweden sees that, too. That was part of the discussion, apparently, between the Prime Minister and the King and Queen and the Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden about northern sovereignty. And they're concerned about Russia incursion. And they're even talking about partnerships, defense partnerships between our two nations, Sweden and Canada, when it comes to the north. That makes all kinds of sense given the circumstances these days. So there's a lot at play here. And I know our government has talked about this. The Defense Minister, David McGuinty, has talked about this. Angela Jolie has mentioned about this, and they're not committing to this. Minister Jolie said the other day that this is a pretty intriguing offer from Saab and from the government of Sweden, but it needs more exploration. They're not ready to jump at it and say, "Whoa, that's a better deal. We're going to sign on here." Let's look at the pros and cons of all of this stuff, and weigh the American offer the same way, the pros and cons. But right now, because of the comments of guys like Hoekstra and because of the attitude of people like Donald Trump and his minions in the White House, there's a long list of cons. It's a pretty good product they've got there, but is it a reliable product? Well, there's some questions about that. And even the brand of jet that the Americans have put up there for us to buy, there's some concerns by the aeronautics experts already that, maybe there's a lot of flaws in this thing that still need to be worked out. So you don't want to get something that's going to have factory defects in it, do you? Because then it's simply sitting there and it's not being effective. So these are all factors that are going to be weighed in. It's not as simple as Pete Hoekstra says or as Donald Trump says. And it's not as simple as you do exactly what we want because, we're America and what we say goes. That's not the rule anymore, not just with Canada, but with so many other NATO nations, and I think right around the world. The whole respect aspect of the United States government and the role that they have played in the global economies and global defense, et cetera, has been tarnished, if not diminished. I think it's probably both of them, actually, and we have to be aware of that. So I don't envy the decision the government's going to have to make here, but I do have confidence that they're going to weigh all of these factors and come out at the right end. Do what's best for Canada, do what's best for our long-term defense, and do what's best long-term for our economy, too. And that may or may not involve the United States in some way, shape, or form. And we can't just hold our breath and say, it's not really the best deal, but, someday things are going to be better with the United States. No guarantees. We have to do it now, and we have to do what we think is best now and into the future. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. If you are on YouTube, great to have you with us. Please hit that notification bell and pass the word on to others. And thank you to everybody who has subscribed over the last little while, too. Your support through your subscriptions really helps us to carry on the work that we're doing here and bring you this information so that we can all make informed decisions and have informed discussions about some of these key issues. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together today. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.